Mrs. Thompson was a teacher who saw her role as more than just a job. It was a calling, a mission to shape lives, one child at a time. Her days were filled with lesson plans, grading papers, and countless meetings, and she rarely took a moment for herself. She didn't mind the long hours or the meager pay because she believed in the power of education to change lives. She had always felt a deep connection to her students, especially those who struggled the most. One autumn afternoon, as the leaves began to fall outside her classroom window, Mrs. Thompson noticed a young boy sitting alone at the back of the class, shoulders slumped, his gaze fixed firmly on the floor. His name was Sam. His attendance was irregular, and when he did show up, he often came late, with his homework incomplete or not at all. Sam was quiet, withdrawn, and clearly troubled. Other teachers had written him off as another problem child. But Mrs. Thompson saw something in him, something that reminded her of herself as a child. She knew there was more to his story. Determined to understand Sam's situation, Mrs. Thompson began to observe him more closely. She noticed the signs, the way his clothes were often too small or too big, his eyes always tired, and the way he flinched when other kids laughed. She learned that Sam came from a broken home. His father was in prison, and his mother worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. Many nights, there was no dinner, and the utilities were often shut off. Despite all this, Mrs. Thompson could see a spark in Sam's eyes whenever he grasped a new concept or completed an assignment. One day after class, she asked him to stay behind. "Sam, I know things are tough for you," she began gently. "But I believe in you. You're smart, and I see so much potential in you. I'm here to help you. Would you like to stay after school for some extra tutoring?" Sam hesitated, looking down at his worn-out sneakers, but he finally nodded. It was the first step in what would become a transformative relationship for both of them. From that day forward, Mrs. Thompson stayed late every day, working with Sam one-on-one. She prepared customized lessons, found creative ways to make learning engaging, and focused on building his confidence. Sometimes they would sit together for hours in the quiet, empty classroom, going over math problems, practicing reading, or just talking. Mrs. Thompson discovered that Sam dreamed of becoming an engineer one day, but he didn't believe he was smart enough or that his circumstances would ever allow it. Her encouragement was relentless. "You are smart enough, Sam," she would say. "Circumstances are just obstacles we learn to overcome." As the weeks passed, Sam's grades began to improve. He started participating in class, and the light in his eyes grew brighter. He even began to smile occasionally, a rare and precious thing. What Sam didn't know was how much Mrs. Thompson was sacrificing to help him. She was a single mother herself, with a young daughter at home. Her ex-husband had left years ago, leaving her to juggle her demanding job with the challenges of raising a child on her own. Money was always tight, and her old car was falling apart, needing repairs she couldn't afford. She often skipped meals to stretch her grocery budget, and her electricity was cut off more than once. But she didn't let her struggles stop her. She took on extra work, grading papers late into the night, and giving up weekends to make ends meet. Every day, she found small ways to support Sam, slipping him snacks when he looked particularly tired, or offering him extra books to take home. She knew she was pushing herself to her limits, but she believed in her mission. "If I can help just one child," she would think, "it will all be worth it." By the end of the year, Sam had turned a corner. He wasn't just passing, he was thriving. When he graduated from her class, he left a note on her desk. Asterisk, "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson, for believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself. I will never forget you." Asterisk, she held that note close to her heart, feeling an immense sense of pride and joy. She watched as he moved on to middle school, then high school. Although they lost touch over the years, she never forgot him, and often wondered how he was doing. Years went by. Mrs. Thompson continued to teach with the same passion, but the years began to take their toll. She started to feel the weight of her financial burdens more heavily. Her daughter was now in college, and the tuition fees were overwhelming. The school's funding was cut, and many teachers, including Mrs. Thompson, were let go. She found herself without a job, too close to retirement to be easily hired elsewhere, and struggling to pay her bills. The meager savings she had managed to put away quickly evaporated in the face of medical bills and everyday expenses. One day, she received a notice of eviction. Her home, the place where she had raised her daughter, the place filled with memories, was about to be taken from her. She felt a deep despair that she had never known before. Every door she knocked on seemed to close in her face. She began selling her belongings just to buy groceries and considered moving into a shelter. Then, just when things seemed their darkest, there was a knock on her door. Mrs. Thompson, frail and tired, opened it to find a courier standing with an envelope. "Are you Mrs. Emily Thompson?" he asked. She nodded, taking the envelope with a trembling hand. Inside was a letter from a law firm, informing her that all her debts had been cleared and that she had received a significant sum of money in her bank account. A note attached simply read, "Thank you for everything you did for me when I was young. Your kindness changed my life." Her eyes filled with tears. She couldn't fathom who could have done this for her. The next day, she received another knock at her door. This time, a well-dressed man stood there with a warm smile. "Hello, Mrs. Thompson," he began. "I don't know if you remember me, but I'm Sam." Mrs. Thompson's eyes widened with recognition, her breath catching in her throat. She saw before her not the shy, struggling boy from the back of her classroom, but a confident, successful businessman. Sam explained how her unwavering belief in him had set him on a path he never imagined. He had worked hard, won scholarships, and eventually became an engineer, starting his own company. "You gave me hope when I had none," he said softly. "You were the first person to ever make me believe I could be someone." Mrs. Thompson could hardly speak, overwhelmed with emotion. "But Sam, I was just doing my job," she whispered. "No," Sam replied, his voice filled with emotion. "You did so much more than that. You gave me a future. When I heard you were in trouble, I knew I had to help. It's because of you that I've achieved anything in my life." Sam didn't stop at just clearing her debts. He offered Mrs. Thompson a position on the board of a new foundation he had created in her name, dedicated to providing tutoring and scholarships to underprivileged students. The foundation aimed to do for others what Mrs. Thompson had done for him: offer hope, guidance, and an unwavering belief in their potential. The foundation's launch event was a grand affair, attended by former students, teachers, and community leaders. Mrs. Thompson sat at the head table, her heart swelling with pride as she saw hundreds of people gathered, many of whom had benefited from the foundation's programs. She was introduced as the heart and soul of the initiative, a woman whose kindness had sparked a movement of generosity. One by one, people shared stories of how their lives had been touched by the foundation. Many of the students, just like Sam, came from difficult backgrounds but were now thriving, thanks to the support they had received. Some of the older attendees, teachers, parents, and community leaders, spoke of how Mrs. Thompson had always been a beacon of hope, quietly working behind the scenes to help others. As she listened, Mrs. Thompson realized that her impact had gone far beyond what she could have imagined. Her small, everyday acts of kindness, given freely and without expectation, had created a ripple effect that spread across many lives. She had planted seeds of goodness that had grown into something far greater than herself. With tears in her eyes, she took the stage. "I never imagined that my simple desire to help a child could lead to something so extraordinary," she began. "But this foundation isn't about me, it's about all of us. It's about believing in the potential of every child, no matter their circumstances. It's about knowing that when you do good, it always comes back to you, often in ways you could never expect." The crowd erupted in applause, and Mrs. Thompson felt a sense of fulfillment and joy she had never known before. She realized that her greatest lesson had been one she learned herself. When you give from the heart, your kindness echoes across time, touching lives, and creating a legacy far beyond anything you could have imagined. And so, the circle of kindness continued, proving once again that doing good, no matter how small the act, always comes back to us, often in the most surprising and beautiful ways.